I've always had an affinity for numbers, and I spent my career in advertising working in media research, which involved me being immersed in ratings data, population, demographic data, and this was before it was called big data. It was just called statistics and numbers. And over the past few years, I've added to my repertoire my weather blog called New York City Weather Archive, which involves me coming up with stories based on going through a ton of weather data. When I first went to college, I was interested in majoring in meteorology. Because of a number of different circumstances, I switched my major, but I've always had the desire to follow weather, and for the past 30 years, I've subscribed to weather data from the National Weather Service for New York, and this trove of data is what I've used as the basis for New York City Weather Archive. In the archive, I've looked at day by day interesting types of weather that have occurred over the past 30 years. And then last year, the federal government or the National Weather Service for the first time made all of their data available for free. Up until last year, you paid on a subscription basis for the data. So I had everything from 1979 forward. Now, everything that they've collected is available. When I say that the data that I get, it's not only high and low in temperatures, it's precipitation on an hourly basis every day, and it's really very, very detailed. I love it. When I began writing the blog, I started with the basics day by day, and what I found is there might be something that happened on a particular day or year that I wanted to go and investigate further. And so I could go through the data and take as long as I wanted. And this is truly big, big data. And I'd often find a whole new story that I could write about, not only for a particular date, but it could become a whole analysis. And on any given day, I probably have a dozen different stories I could look into. And this is because I actually have gone through the data. And as I'm going through the data, looking for to make one particular point or do a particular analysis, I see other types of data emerging. It's almost sort of like if you're underwater and you're seeing these currents. And I think that this is, of course, a skill that not a lot of people have, to be able to have the data. It's actually like a living and breathing thing. And I find it, you probably could tell, very, very exciting. And I think it really enriches the blog, because I don't think you're going to find a blog that goes into as in depth or looks at data in such an interesting way. A good example of what I'm talking about is last month, the month of April. It ended up being exactly right on average. And I know from looking at the data that doesn't happen very often. You might have temperatures a tenth of a degree off, or 0.4, or a degree above or below, but it's rare that you have a temperature that's right at what the average should be. So I had that information. I wanted to see when was the last time that happened. And as I'm looking at the information, I noticed that even though there could be months in which the temperature was at average, for the most part, the high and the low usually were above or below average at different rates. They would average out though. So what I'm saying is you could have a month that was right at average, but the high temperature was 3 above average and the low temperature was 3 degrees below average. What made April of this year so interesting, it was not only was the overall temperature right at average, but the high and low were almost right at the average, which is very rare. So this is something you'd have to actually go through all the data in order to find out. This isn't data that's like readily available. I mean, the readily available data is basically high and low, and you have to decide for yourself how you're going to look at it. And also another report that I'm going to be issuing shortly is I was curious to see what had been the largest and the smallest swings in daily temperature. Usually there's about what's called a diurnal variation. There's a difference of about 14 degrees between the high and low. But there, I was curious to see what the extremes are. So by looking through data over the past 40 years, I found that the swings are anywhere from, there have been one day out of all the years I looked at that had a 1 degree difference in the high and low, and there have been a number of days that had a difference of about 40 degrees. What I noticed, a pattern that was developing, is that in this century, the differences between high and low are getting smaller and smaller, which is, has been attributed to climate change. And so you used to see more instances of there being like a 15 to 20 degree difference between high and low. And now you're seeing that's rare, and you're actually seeing more and more smaller differences, like between 11 and 12 degrees. And a lot of the change, though, is because of the low temperatures are getting warmer. The high temperatures really aren't going as much. It's the low temperatures. So it's really rewarding when you could see some of the things that you read about in science journals about global warming. You actually see it borne out in the actual data. So working on the weather blog is very similar to the work I do in media research, which is immersing myself in data, whether it's TV ratings, population, data from the Census Bureau, demographics, magazine audience reading information. It's data. I enjoy working with data, and I can tell stories. So it's just putting a different hat on when I do the weather blog. I also do something similar to baseball statistics. And I have a Twitter account called Baseball Snips, because I look at the daily scores, and I pull out certain pieces of information and I track. So again, it's something I enjoy doing, very easy, and it's not drudgery. I know some people can't understand how I can do this and get pleasure. It just works for me. I mean, I could look at the data, and there's stories there, and almost so many that I have to write them on a separate piece of paper to keep track of them, because there's always things I want to go and look back. So yeah, I've enjoying having blogging to be able to express this data as opposed to keeping it all to myself in my apartment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about baseball and what I track and report on Twitter. What I've always done, always, past 10 years, I've kept track of for every team, the various scores. So I can see, how many times a team has won a game or lost a game by 1-0 score, 2-1, 3-1, so on and so forth. And also the number of times it's scored 10 runs, 11 runs, 12 runs. And I see, different patterns. And it's just, if you really enjoy numbers and statistics, and if you're a baseball fan, you probably do, so often you see some like really peculiar but great things. Like, for instance, yesterday, which was May 15th, the Yankees lost to the Seattle Mariners 12-2. And that happened to be the first time for the season that Seattle scored more than 10 runs in a game. And it was also the first time that the Yankees gave up more than 10 runs in a game. So it's things like that. I can see how many times a team has been shut out or has pitched a shutout. Again, all this data is available, and there are many people that do this type of thing. So it's fun to share it with others on Twitter and see what they've come up with. And I'm always amazed when someone comes up with something that I find fascinating, because I always think I have the most fascinating data. This past winter, I wrote a blog for the weather blog, and it was called Too Cold for Snow. So I looked through, again, it was just something that came to my mind, like in New York, what is the coldest temperatures we've had for a big snowstorm? So I looked through all the data back to 1960. I decided that was my cutoff point for this, even though I could go back to 1900. And I looked at the high and low temperatures for all these different snowstorms. And the coldest, there was a snowstorm back in the late 60s. I believe it was in 1967, where the high temperature was 16 and the low temperature was 7. But there was over a foot of snow. And the other end, while I was looking at the coldest, I decided to look at, have there what are the warmest temperatures for big snowstorms. And actually, again, this sort of is an indication of climate change, that there have been many big snowstorms in the past 10 years, but they've also been accompanied by relatively mild temperatures. Of course, they're around freezing, but they're like low temperatures right around 30 and highs of 35, and yet we've had huge snowstorms. Actually, the warmer temperatures you get, usually there's the likelihood there's more moisture, but that's happening more and more. And along the lines of climate change in snow, there's over the past 15 years, there's been a much more often large snowstorms than there have been over the past 100 years. Like, it used to be every 8 or 9 years you get a snowstorm of like a foot or more, but since the year 2000, it's been happening once every 3 years. So temperatures may not be getting colder in the winter in New York, but there's actually more snow falling. Presently, I'm working on a project that looks at every high and low temperature that's occurred for every day of the year, and my goal is to see what is the most common temperature, not only by year but then over the course of 25 or 30 years. For instance, last year the most common high temperature was 78 degrees. It happened about 13 times. But if you go by year, there's a different temperature usually. I've gone through 5 years so far, and over the course of 5 years, the most common high temperature is 50 degrees. And after that, then it's 83, 81, 80. So I'm just be curious to see how, as the years go by, what types of patterns emerge. I'm doing it also for low temperature. A post that I wrote last year that got a lot of traffic was looking at the number of days in each year that had temperatures above 90 degrees. Now, for the most part, we just say, okay, you had 35 or 28, and that's it. What I wanted to look at was not only how many days were in the 90s, but over what period. For instance, in 1991 and 1993, they both had 39 days that were above 90 degrees, which is the most on record in New York. However, if you look at each year, one year, 1991, had them occurring over a wider span. The first was in April, and the last was the end of September, whereas 1993 was much more concentrated. So even though they had the same number, really 1993 was probably more uncomfortable because they were occurring much more often. And another analysis I did with a separate blog was, even though 91 and 93 had the most days above 90, I've noticed, and this is very frustrating to a lot of weather aficionados. It seems New York has a lot of days that have high temperatures of 89, and for whatever reason, 90 for a high or below 32 for a high, those are sort of standard measures, and so hot is considered 90 or above. So you get these days above 80 that hit 89. It's very frustrating. What I did was I wanted to see how many days do we actually have that hits 89. And it turns out that it was just 3 years ago, 2010, actually had a dozen days that were at 89. So if you combine the days that were above 89 with the 90-degree days, which I believe there were 37, that year actually had the most days of 89 or above. It even passed, 91 and 93. So that was just another way of looking at the data to come up with a different story. Well, I have a fun story that has to do with the fact that I have access to all of the weather data now beyond the years that I actually paid for it. The first time I ever came to New York, I drove out with my brother it was August 1976. It was a Sunday night, and I remember we were going across northern New Jersey, and we were just getting a ton of rain. It was just raining very heavily. We were slowly making our way, and then we made it to our destination. So that always stuck with me, that heavy rain. So last month I decided, well, I'm going to see if I can pinpoint if that actually, how much rain fell. Was it a big rainstorm? So I pinpointed it. It was August 9th, 1976, and I see that almost 4 inches of rain fell like that night from like 8 o'clock to like 2 that morning. And so in looking at it, and that's extremely heavy rain. And so I investigated further, and I looked up, I Googled to see about hurricanes that have hit the area. And it turns out that evening, Hurricane Bell crossed over, it made landfall on Jones Beach that evening. And to think that we were completely clueless. We were driving there and we didn't even know anything about it. And not until now did we know that it was actually, we were driving in like the hurricane. It was actually the strongest hurricane until Hurricane Gloria, like 9 years later. So I just found that very, very gratifying to find out that information from this wealth of weather data. One of the interesting things I found about Hurricane Sandy was the fact that it had so little rain. It was, the amount of rain was just about an inch, which is not extraordinary. I mean, Hurricane Irene the year before was like close to 7 inches of rain. I mean, when we get tropical systems, it's a huge amount of rain. So, and a lot of times we equate the amount of rain with the severity of the storm, when it turns out that's not the case. And as we all know, what made Sandy so destructive was the wind and the wave action, because the rain certainly wasn't a problem.